The recruitment office smelled like disinfectant and bureaucracy, and the specific despair of fluorescent lighting at 800 on a Tuesday. Corporal Dean Fetch sat in a plastic chair that had been designed by someone who had never sat in a plastic chair, filling out forms that asked questions he had not expected. Military service record, standard, combat experience, basic training plus 3 years of perimeter security at a base in Nevada that had not been attacked once during his entire posting, which he considered a personal achievement in deterrence. Special skills. He wrote * wilderness navigation, cold weather operations, desert survival, campfire cooking, weather prediction by cloud formation, predator de-escalation. The woman behind the bulletproof glass looked at his file. She looked at him. She looked at the file again with the expression of someone who had found something unexpected and was deciding whether to mention it. Special skills, she said, predator de-escalation. Yes, ma'am. Can you describe what that means? When you encounter a large predator in the wild, there are ways to make it decide you're not worth the effort, Fetch said. Bears, mostly, but it works on mountain lions, too. You just have to know how they think. She made a note. Corporal Fetch, this application is for the Galactic Defense Coalition exchange program. Yes, ma'am, it said interesting assignment and travel opportunities. I've been at the same base for 3 years. The program involves training with alien species on what they classify as an extreme survival world. Most applicants go through 18 months of advanced preparation. I did a survival course in Alaska last winter, Fetch said, and I spent a week in the Sonoran Desert without resupply as a personal project. How different could it be? She stared at him for a long moment with the expression of someone watching a person walk cheerfully towards something that she could not technically stop them from doing. She stamped his forms. Report to Transport Bay 7 tomorrow at 0600, she said. Don't say I didn't give you an opportunity to reconsider. I won't, Fetch said. Thanks. Is there parking validation? The transport ship was larger than anything Fetch had been on before, which was not saying much since his previous space travel had consisted of one orbital shuttle to a station and back. But it was impressive nonetheless. The interior looked like a military vessel had been diplomatically furnished for multiple species simultaneously, which was exactly what it was, and the result was a corridor that contained chairs of 7 different sizes and a water feature that served no apparent purpose, except that one of the species aboard apparently found flowing water calming. Fetch found his assigned quarters, stowed his gear, and went to find the other members of the exchange program. There were 4 of them, assembled in what the ship called a briefing room, which was large enough to accommodate the considerable size variation between its occupants. Commander Vethkar of the Sarathi military was 7 feet of scaled precision in a uniform that cost more than Fetch's annual salary. His scales were currently the deep blue of someone who had never been significantly wrong about anything and expected to continue in this direction indefinitely. He held himself like a being for whom uncertainty was a scheduling issue rather than a real condition. Dr. Pelera of the Delphi Science Institute resembled what would happen if a dolphin decided to pursue an academic career. She communicated through a translation device worn at her throat that gave everything she said a slight aquatic quality, as though her words were arriving from somewhere with better water. She had spent 50 years studying survival across 12 planetary environments and had documentation for all of it. Captain Orvak of the Manthari War Division looked like something that had been designed by a committee that had been asked to produce the most efficient predator possible and had taken the brief very seriously. His forearms moved independently of each other, and his compound eyes processed 17 spectrums of light. He had won the Manthari War Games 4 times and had never lost a soldier under his command. Lieutenant Sella of the Solari Strategic Corps appeared to be made of living crystal that did not obey the same light refraction rules as regular crystal. When she moved, she produced a sound like distant wind chimes. Her species could calculate battlefield probabilities in real time and had never in 600 years of military history miscalculated one. Then there was Fetch. He had brown hair and an average build and a notebook in his chest pocket, and was looking around the briefing room with the interested expression of someone who had just arrived somewhere new and was making mental notes. You are the human, Vethkar said. His translator rendered his voice with the authority of someone making an observation that was also a judgment. Corporal Dean Fetch, Fetch said, extending his hand. Vethkar looked at it for a moment, identified it as a greeting gesture from his cultural briefing, and shook it with the careful precision of someone who had practiced a physical interaction they found confusing. "Tell me, Corporal Fetch," Vethkar said, settling back into what Fetch was already reading as his default posture. Arms folded, scales in command blue, the stance of someone who was the senior officer present and wanted this to be known without having to say it. "What survival training has your species provided for this mission?" "Standard stuff," Fetch said, taking a seat. "Basic wilderness survival across multiple biomes, cold weather operations, desert ops, some maritime stuff from a rotation near the coast. I've done a lot of personal expeditions as well." "Personal expeditions," Dr. Pelera's translator said with the quality of someone writing something down. "Can you specify?" "Sure, camping mostly. I've done the Appalachian Trail, a section of the Pacific Crest, a winter traverse in Alaska, spent a week alone in the Sonoran Desert. I did a thing in Scotland last year, which was its own experience." "Scotland," Pelera said. "Scottish Highlands specifically. Went on leave, thought I'd do some hill walking. It rained sideways for 4 days. The trails turned into streams, something that might have been a deer kept following me and I still don't know why. Lost my fire kit on day 2 and had to work out an alternative. Beautiful country though, incredible wildlife." He paused. "Something tried to eat my tent on the last night. I think it was a sheep." The briefing room was quiet. "You find this preferable to indoor accommodation," Orvak's translator said. It was phrased as a question but landed as an expression of genuine confusion. "I like being outside," Fetch said. "You get used to the weather. Most of the time it's fine once you know what to expect." "Perhaps," Vethkar said, with the tone of someone adjusting a plan, "you should understand the nature of our destination before we continue this discussion." He brought up a display that showed a planet that looked like all of Earth's most hostile environments had been combined into one location, and then given additional hostile environments on top. Fetch looked at it with the expression of someone who had opened a menu and found it interesting. "Mordes 7, Vethkar said, Class 9 Death World. The gravity is 40% above standard, which is sufficient to cause structural failure in most biological forms over extended exposure. The atmosphere requires filtered breathing apparatus for all known species. The local fauna is entirely predatory and highly aggressive. The weather patterns include acid precipitation, electrical storms capable of disabling most unshielded technology, and temperature variations of up to 100 degrees in a single hour." "What kind of acid?" Fetch asked. "I beg your pardon." "The precipitation. Sulfuric, hydrochloric. Concentration levels matter. Strong sulfuric is a different problem than weak acetic." "The exact," Pelera's translator said, and then paused as she apparently checked her documentation. Asterisk composition varies. "Primarily sulfuric-based, concentration approximately 40%. Fetch considered this. "That's meaningful. You'd want to keep exposed skin covered." He made a note in his notebook. "Good to know. What's the base camp situation?" "There is a research installation," Vethkar said slowly, his scales shifting toward a slightly different blue, staffed by a rotating human military officer who has been running the facility for 6 months. "The exercise is 72 hours in a section of the planet called Murder Canyon, following 2 weeks of environmental acclimatization." "Murder Canyon," Fetch repeated. "Is that the official name or a nickname?" "Official designation," Pelera said, "assigned after the 3rd survey team." "Fair enough." Fetch made another note. "Does the base have a kitchen? I like to know what the food situation is before I go somewhere." Something happened to the briefing room atmosphere. Fetch noticed that the 4 other occupants were exchanging looks that communicated quite a lot without words. Vethkar's scales had shifted to a purple that was not quite the command blue he had started with. "The nutritional supplies," Vethkar said carefully, "are sealed emergency ration packs designed for maximum caloric efficiency under hostile conditions. Most organic matter on Mordes 7 is either toxic, carnivorous, or both." "Like MREs, asterisk," Fetch said. "Got it. I brought some supplements and a fishing rod just in case. You never know." "A fishing rod," Pelera said. "Always useful. Even if there's no fish, it's good for testing surfaces before you step on them, reaching things you don't want to touch directly, all sorts of applications." Captain Orvak's forearms, which had been moving in the steady, independent rhythm Fetch had noticed when he walked in, had sped up slightly. Sella's crystalline structure had dimmed a barely perceptible amount. Corporal Fetch, Sella said, her translated voice carrying the careful precision of someone who was running a calculation and had not finished it yet. Your species voluntarily consumes substances that cause physical pain for pleasure. Hot peppers, yeah. Some people compete to see who can handle the highest concentration. It's a whole thing. You expose yourselves to temperature extremes for recreation. Saunas, ice baths, that kind of thing, builds resilience. Some cultures have been doing it for thousands of years. You coexist with predatory animals. Dogs are descended from wolves. Cats are basically small ambush predators that we've invited into our houses. My aunt has a python. My neighbor's kid has a tarantula as a pet. Fetch paused. Actually, I've been wanting to ask, what does Morty's 7's wildlife look like? The briefing materials were vague. Vethkar's scales, over the course of the following 30 seconds, progressed through purple into a brownish gray that Fetch would later learn indicated deep unease, and settled on a yellow-green that he would eventually understand, meant this is significantly worse than I had planned for. Perhaps, Vethkar said, we should review the mission parameters in greater detail. Sounds good, Fetch said, and turned to a fresh page in his notebook. The transport hummed through space for 11 days. Fetch spent the time productively. He read everything he could find about Morty's 7 in the ship's database, which was less than he would have liked because most of the official documentation was classified as not recommended reading for personnel with a history of anxiety disorders. He talked to the other trainees at meals. He asked a lot of questions about their species and their homeworlds and their survival training, and he listened to the answers with the genuine interest of someone who found other people and places inherently fascinating. He was, Pelara noted in her personal research log, the first human she had spent extended time with, and he was not what she had expected. The Death World classification of Earth had prepared her for an aggressive, territorial creature with poorly developed social instincts. What she was encountering was a being with excellent social instincts, strong intellectual curiosity, and a fundamental orientation toward the world that she was struggling to categorize. You seem interested in everything, she observed on day 6, when he had spent an hour asking detailed questions about Delphi oceanic ecology. I am interested in everything, Fetch said. You don't meet a xenobiologist with 50 years of field experience every day. I'd be an idiot not to ask. Most species we encounter find our appearance unsettling, she said. Her translator gave the words a slightly underwater quality. You look like a dolphin that went to graduate school, Fetch said. Dolphins are great, very smart, good communicators. I once had a close encounter with a bottlenose in Florida that I think about fairly often. He paused. What's the most interesting thing you've found in 50 years of field work? She told him. He listened for 2 hours. He asked follow-up questions that suggested he had been paying close attention. In her personal log that night, she wrote, the human's interest appears entirely genuine. His questions demonstrate real comprehension rather than social courtesy. Beginning to suspect that the Death World classification may be describing the correct planet while missing important information about the species it produced. Morty's 7 filled the transport's viewports on day 11. It looked like a threat. Not the specific threat of a weapon or a military installation, but the broader, more fundamental threat of an environment that had decided, at a geological level, to be hostile to existence in general. The cloud cover was the color of an ongoing argument. Lightning moved through it in colors that weren't quite right for lightning. The surface, visible in patches through the cloud, was jagged and dark and looked like it was waiting for something to land on it. Final approach, the pilot announced. All personnel prepare for hostile environment protocols. Around Fetch, his fellow trainees were sealing themselves into equipment that represented the best protective technology their respective species had developed. Vethkar's environmental suit had its own life support system and enough sensor coverage to detect threats at a 100-meter radius. Pelara's breathing apparatus was a precision-engineered system that processed the local atmosphere through 6 filtration stages. Orvak's exoskeleton doubled his already considerable size and had built-in weapons systems for emergency situations. Sela had activated an energy shield that made the air around her shimmer. Fetch checked his gear. Standard uniform, combat boots, backpack. He had left the heavy equipment in storage on the advice of the ancient and very experienced wisdom that said you only carry what you can actually use, and he couldn't use a powered exoskeleton that wasn't fitted for him. Human Fetch, Vethkar said through his suit's external speakers. Where is your environmental protection? I've got a jacket, Fetch said, patting his pack. Weather report said variable, might rain. The rain is sulfuric acid. 40% concentration, yeah, I'll keep my jacket on. The gravity will. 40% above standard. I've carried heavier loads in training with a full pack uphill. Should be manageable. The atmosphere. Metallic taste, some particulate. My lungs will adapt in a few breaths. Fetch looked out the porthole at Morty's 7's surface. Has anyone tried just acclimatizing to the atmosphere rather than filtering it? The shuttle touched down with a thud that rattled everyone's dental work. The airlock opened. The gravity hit Fetch like a backpack full of rocks, which was an accurate description because he had carried a backpack full of rocks during a training exercise designed to simulate exactly this, and he knew what it felt like and how long it took to stop noticing. He breathed in. The air tasted like a thunderstorm filtered through metal. His lungs registered the difference and adapted, which took 3 breaths. Around him, the enhanced suits and exoskeletons and atmospheric processors were working overtime. Vethkar's environmental unit was running diagnostics that sounded unhappy. Pelera was breathing audibly through her apparatus with the careful effort of someone working against resistance. Orvak's exoskeleton was already showing stress indicators on the joints. Sela's energy shield was maintaining itself, but at a visible cost. The base installation was exactly what you got when you asked military engineers to build something on a planet that was actively trying to destroy everything on it. Everything was reinforced, sealed, and had clearly been hit by things it had been reinforced against. Warning signs covered every surface in 12 languages and 3 mathematical notation systems. A human man of approximately 50 stood at the base entrance, watching them disembark. He had the quality of someone who had been in a difficult environment for long enough that it had stopped being difficult and had become their normal, which in Fetch's experience was either a good sign or a concerning one depending on the environment. His hair was slightly too long for regulation, and his expression was the expression of a man who had made his peace with something. Colonel Harwick, he said, I run this installation. Been here 6 months. Welcome to Morty's 7. He looked at the assembled trainees and their equipment, then he looked at Fetch. Something in his expression shifted, the specific recognition of a man seeing someone who was going to be fine and having complicated feelings about what that meant for the training program. You're the new human. Corporal Fetch, good to meet you, sir. Harwick looked at Fetch's gear. He looked at Fetch's jacket. He looked at Fetch's notebook, which was already out because Fetch had been taking notes on the base's construction during the walk from the shuttle. Come inside, Harwick said. I'll run the orientation briefing. There's coffee. Perfect, Fetch said. I've been looking forward to that. The orientation briefing was comprehensive. Colonel Harwick had been running it for 6 months and had refined it into something that communicated the maximum amount of alarming information in the minimum time. Because in his experience, the sooner everyone understood what Morty's 7 wanted to do to them, the sooner they could start arguing productively about how to survive it. The local fauna included pack-hunting plants with a kill radius of 20 meters, predators that could phase through solid matter, insects the size of small aircraft with a venom that Harwick described as *emphatic*, and something called a phase bear. The phase bear, Harwick said, advancing the display to a photograph of something that looked like a grizzly bear that had been redesigned by something with a surplus of nightmare, can teleport. Short range, maybe 50 meters, but enough to render standard evasion tactics useless. They hunt by thermal signature and motion detection. When they materialize, they do it in kill range. He paused. Don't run. Running tells them your prey. What do you do? Orvak asked. His forearms were twitching. Stand still. They'll generally assess and move on if you don't trigger their predator-prey response. Generally, Pelera said. Mostly, I've had good results. Harwick moved to the weather display. Weather patterns, acid precipitation on a cycle that averages twice a week but isn't perfectly regular, so check the atmospheric sensors before going out. Electrical storms, you'll get 20 minutes warning from the sky color before they hit. Temperature swings of up to 80 degrees Celsius can happen within an hour. Dress in layers. He looked at the assembled group. Any questions so far? Sella's crystalline form was dim in a way that suggested she was processing more than her system liked. Vethkar's scales had progressed to a brown-purple that Fetch was identifying as asterisk. This is a lot of information. Pelara was taking notes very rapidly. Orvak's antennae were making small movements that probably meant something. Fetch raised his hand. Corporal, is there a map of the water sources? And what's the phase bear population density in the training areas? I want to know if we're likely to encounter one or two during the acclimatization period, or if it's going to be more frequent. Harwick looked at him for a moment. I'll send you the full environmental survey after the briefing. Great, also hot sauce. Building C cafeteria, third shelf. Previous human left a bottle of something industrial before his rotation ended. Harwick paused. He said it might be useful for equipment maintenance. I never checked. Carolina Reaper, Fetch asked. Label said Reaper sauce, yeah. Probably not for equipment, asterisk Fetch said. That's for food. He must have left it for the next human. Harwick looked at him. He looked at the other trainees. He made a note on his data pad with the specific energy of someone who was going to file a report about this later. Let's start with a perimeter walk, he said. Standard acclimatization. We go out, we identify landmarks, we come back, 30 minutes. Can I bring my fishing rod? Fetch asked. I like to have it for checking terrain. Harwick opened his mouth, thought about it, and closed it again. Sure, he said. The perimeter walk was where Morty's 7 decided to establish its position. The moment they passed the base's protective barrier, the planet began doing what it did, which was attempt to communicate through every available channel that it was not interested in being hospitable. The air carried sounds that suggested the local wildlife was conducting a meeting at some distance and had not reached a consensus on what to do about the newcomers. The ground had sections that looked stable and were not, which Fetch tested methodically with the end of his fishing rod before stepping on them, which meant he didn't fall into the glistening pit that Orvak's exoskeleton barely avoided. The ground is not stable, Harwick explained. Pseudo-solid sections over cavities requires ground-penetrating sensors or a stick, asterisk Fetch said, poking another section and watching it shift. Listen to how it sounds when you tap it. Hollow versus solid, same principle as checking river ice. He demonstrated. Hear the difference. Harwick listened. He nodded slowly. I've been using sensors for 6 months. Sensors work, so does a stick. Fetch moved forward, testing as he went. What's that grass? Razor grass, Harwick said. Do not touch it. Yeah, I can see the edge structure from here. Each blade is basically a cutting implement. Fetch crouched to examine it at close range, staying clear of the cutting radius. Interesting. How has it evolved this defensive mechanism against grazing animals, or does it have some active predation element? Both, Pelara said from behind him, speaking with the strained attention of a xenobiologist trying to process a human crouching voluntarily near something that could cut through military-grade material. The blade structure is defensive, but the root system releases chemical attractants that draw prey close enough for. A sound emerged from the tree line. It was the sound of something very large moving through vegetation that was fighting back, combined with the specific acoustic quality of something that had learned to move through space in discontinuous jumps. Phase Bear, Harwick said quietly, nobody move. Everyone went still. The sound of equipment powering down to minimum was very loud in the sudden silence. Vethkar's suit reduced its operations. Pelara's breathing apparatus went to its quietest mode. Orvak's exoskeleton cut its background systems. 30 seconds of stillness. Fetch stood still for approximately 30 seconds, and then turned his head 45 degrees to get a better line of sight on whatever was making the sound, because he had been told not to move in a way that triggered predator-prey responses, and turning your head slowly was not that kind of movement. Don't move, Harwick whispered. I'm not moving, Fetch whispered back. I'm looking. There's a difference. Do they have good depth perception with compound eyes? Before Harwick could answer, the phase bear materialized 20 feet away. It was the size of a small truck, which was the comparison Fetch's brain produced immediately, and which his brain found useful even though the thing in front of him was nothing like a truck, and nothing like any bear he had encountered. It was composed primarily of shadow in a way that was not a metaphor, but a genuine description of its physical structure. Its eyes were the red of fresh blood. When it opened its mouth, reality bent slightly around its teeth, which suggested that its dentition interfaced with spacetime in a way that the biology briefing had described as structurally atypical. It looked at the group. It processed the group. It settled its attention on Fetch with the specific focus of an apex predator, identifying the element of a scenario that it did not have an established category for. It tilted its enormous head. "Wow, Fetch said, in the tone of someone encountering something genuinely impressive. "That's remarkable. Look at the way it's assessing. It's not going to attack, it's curious. The head tilt is the same thing dogs do when they're processing something new." The phase bear made a sound that was not a growl and not a roar, but something that sat between them, carrying a frequency that suggested questions. Fetch raised his hand in a wave, not a fast movement. Slow, visible, the specific gesture of something establishing that it was not a threat and was not prey. The phase bear regarded him for 4 full seconds. Then it phased out of existence and was gone. The silence lasted for a long time. "It left," Orvac said finally, with the tone of someone reporting a geological event. "Yeah, Fetch said, it decided we weren't interesting, or threatening. One of the two," he made a note. "What do they eat normally? I'm guessing not humans, since that wasn't predation behavior." Colonel Harwick was looking at him. His expression had the quality of someone updating a mental model in real time. "Corporal Fetch, he said. "Sir, have you done much wildlife work back on Earth?" "Not professionally, but I grew up near the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. You learn the local rules pretty fast." Harwick nodded slowly. He made a note on his data pad. "Let's head back to base," he said. "I need to send some preliminary reports." Day 3 was the Singing Valley. The valley was riddled with gas pockets that detonated with enough force to launch a body into orbit, triggered by seismic activity that the ground conducted through a network of subsurface channels that standard sensors rendered as noise rather than signal. The official crossing protocol required bomb disposal equipment, a minimum team of 12 specialists, and emergency medical support on standby. The documented casualty rate for even well-equipped teams was 15%. The trainees assembled with their gear. Vethkar had recalibrated his environmental suit to maximum seismic sensing. Pelara had a specialist scanner that she had apparently requested from the ship's equipment stores the previous night. Orvac's exoskeleton had been fitted with blast dampeners. Sella had calculated 17 different crossing trajectories and was prepared to recalculate in real time. Fetch had a peanut butter sandwich, because he had been up early and the cafeteria did not open until 700, and he had packed lunch the previous night against this eventuality. "The ground, he said, studying the valley entrance, sounds different." "That's the geological activity," Harwick said. "The gas channels run." "No, I mean the sound changes before it blows." Fetch walked to the edge and stood still listening. "It's like ice before it cracks. There's a frequency change. Lower then higher right before the detonation." He walked a few steps into the valley, stopped, listened. "Hear that? That section's fine, that section's active." He pointed left, then right. "Go left." "My seismic sensors," Vethkar said, consulting his equipment, "are indicating a different." The section to the right detonated with a sound like a controlled explosion, sending debris in all directions and demonstrating with some emphasis that Fetch's assessment had been correct. Everyone looked at Fetch. Fetch was eating his sandwich. "The sensors are calibrated for single-point detection," he said, not unkindly. "But the sound propagates through the whole substrate before the detonation. You have to listen to the system rather than specific points." He walked forward. "I'll go first. Follow my exact path." He went first. He stopped occasionally to listen, changed direction twice, pointed out 2 sections that blew 40 seconds after he had avoided them. He reached the other side, turned around, and waved. The full military expedition followed his path exactly. Their equipment contributed nothing to the crossing. Their equipment was quite expensive. Fetch was on his second half of the sandwich when Vethkar reached him. The commander's scales had achieved a color that sat between brown and purple and had not been there at the start of the day. "You listen to the ground," Vethkar said. "Yeah, old habit. When you're in the backcountry, you learn to read terrain sounds. A mountain stream sounds different before a flash flood. A snowfield sounds different before avalanche conditions. This is the same principle. He looked at the valley behind them. The gas channels are running on a pressure cycle, probably geothermal. If you mapped the sound frequencies over an hour, you could predict the detonation pattern pretty accurately. That information would have been extremely useful, Pereira said, with the tone of someone who had watched 15% casualty rates happen when they did not need to. Happy to show you what I'm listening for, Fetch said. I'm going to map the pattern this afternoon anyway. It's interesting geology. He did. His notes from that afternoon contained 40 minutes of sound frequency observations and a preliminary model of the valley's detonation cycle that the base's geological team had not managed to produce in 6 months of sensor data. Harwick filed a report that evening that was significantly different in tone from the reports he normally filed. It included the phrase, "Recommend expanded study of human baseline sensory processing," and was flagged for immediate review by the Exchange Program's Oversight Committee. Day 7 was the aggressive forest. The trees had evolved past photosynthesis into active predation, which was not a sentence that made comfortable reading, but was an accurate description of what they were encountering. The canopy moved with a speed that was inconsistent with wind activity. The undergrowth had chemistry that violated several established principles of botany. The standard approach required flame units, chainsaw teams, and enough ordnance to significantly reduce the forest's area. The operation typically took a full day and left the approach corridor looking like something had disagreed with it vigorously. Orvac had his weapons array ready. Vethkar had a cutting tool that could process military-grade materials. Pereira had her scanner and a set of chemical countermeasures. Sella had calculated 42 tactical approaches and was cross-referencing them. Fetch had borrowed a pocket knife from Colonel Harwick, who had given it to him with the expression of a man who had stopped asking questions, because the questions led somewhere he was not prepared to go. That one, Fetch said, pointing to a tree that was currently attempting to impale a bird that had made poor navigational choices. It's using motion tracking. See how it's leading the bird rather than tracking it. The tree is calculating trajectory, Sella said, her crystal form dimming slightly as she ran the analysis. That is a sophisticated predation strategy for a plant. My grandmother's roses were similar. Not the predation, but the aggression. You'd go to prune them and they'd catch you every time. Fetch looked at the tree. You have to show them the hierarchy. Go in confident, don't react to contact, and redirect when they grab rather than pulling away. You want to physically enter a forest of carnivorous trees, Orvac said, his forearms twitching in both independent directions simultaneously. I want to get some cuttings, Fetch said. That one near the back has a growth structure I've never seen. I'll be out in a few hours. He went in. The trees attacked him once, which was once more than Fetch had hoped for and significantly less than they had done to every other documented entrant. What happened next was not, strictly speaking, describable in terms that made conventional sense, except that it involved Fetch speaking to the trees in a firm and specific voice for approximately 4 minutes. After that, the trees left him alone with the specific body language of organisms that had made an assessment and reached a conclusion. He emerged 3 hours and 12 minutes later with a canvas bag of plant cuttings, a collection of seeds that he described as interesting, and a hand-drawn map of the safest paths through the forest that turned out to be accurate to within 2 meters. What did you say to them? Pereira asked, her translator carrying the quality of a scientist encountering a phenomenon she did not have a category for. Hard to describe exactly, more about what I communicated generally. Fetch looked at the tree line. They're aggressive because they've evolved in an environment where everything that comes near them is trying to eat them. Show them you're not a threat and not prey, and there's no reason for conflict. He paused. My grandmother said the same thing about her roses. She was right about the roses. Your grandmother's roses, Vethkar said slowly. She had a prize-winning garden. You did not mess with those roses uninvited. Vethkar's scales had reached a color that did not correspond to any standard Sarathi emotional state. He appeared to be experiencing something that his species' emotional range had not previously required a color for. By day 10, the group had reorganized without anyone formally deciding to reorganize it. Fetch walked at the front. The others followed him. This had not been ordered or agreed upon. It had simply become the arrangement that resulted in the fewest incidents per hour, and everyone, including Vethkar, who had strong feelings about appropriate hierarchy, had tacitly concluded that the hierarchy currently useful was the one that kept them alive. "I don't understand it," Pelara confided to her personal log. "Human fetch approaches every lethal scenario as an interesting problem with a practical solution. Yesterday, when we encountered the electric eels in the Screaming River, he asked if anyone had brought fishing line. This morning, when a phase bear materialized 12 meters from our position, he noted that it was a different individual from the one we had previously encountered based on its eye coloration, and watched it leave without changing his posture. I have 50 years of field experience across 12 planetary environments. I have never encountered a species that interfaced with hostile ecosystems the way humans apparently do." The Screaming River was, objectively, the worst thing Fetch had encountered on Morty's 7 so far, which he noted made it the most interesting. The river screamed because of the acoustic properties of its channel and the constant electrical activity in the water, which Pelara confirmed when he asked, and which he had suspected from the way the sound carried. The electric eels were enormous, the size of subway cars, Fetch thought, though he had only been on a subway 3 times and the comparison was approximate. The current would move a significant mass. The water was acidic. "You cannot swim this," Orvac said. He was running calculations on his exoskeleton systems, which were clearly finding the results discouraging. "Standard crossing requires a portable bridge and full electrical insulation," Vethkar said. His scale color had been in emergency territory for 2 days and had settled into it like someone settling into an uncomfortable chair. "We do not have that equipment." Fetch was studying the river. He was looking at the water chemistry as indicated by the shoreline rock formations. He was listening to the acoustic properties of the screaming. He was watching the movement patterns of the eels, which were doing what large, intelligent animals did in their own territory, following established routes, maintaining spacing, doing the things that made sense to do when your territory was working correctly. He began taking his boots off. "What are you doing?" Vethkar asked. "Going for a swim. Going to cross and confirm the far bank's stable before we figure out the group crossing." "The water will." "The rocks on this bank aren't dissolving. Concentrations lower than the briefing suggested, probably diluted by inflow further upstream." He looked at his boots. "I'd rather not get acid on the leather." "The eels will. Only if I make sudden movements near them. They're not aggressive right now, they're patrolling. If I go in at the downstream edge of their patrol pattern, I'm not in their territory." He waded in. The water was cold and metallic and mildly unpleasant in the way of something that was not quite right, but was not the catastrophe the briefing had implied. He moved carefully, at the downstream edge, in the deliberate, unhurried way of someone who had spent years moving through habitats that required you to not be alarming. The eels surfaced, they processed him, they determined that he was not behaving like prey or predator, they resumed their patrol. He swam across in a breaststroke that conserved energy and kept his movements even and unhurried. He paused in the middle to wave at the group and point out something that appeared to be a species of fish he hadn't seen in the briefing materials. He reached the far bank. He was thinking, standing on the far bank looking at the water, about whether the eel return trip was feasible, when one of the large eels surfaced and appeared to be investigating him from close range with what he interpreted as curiosity rather than aggression. He thought about the energy bars in his pack. He held a piece out over the water. The eel ate it with the deliberation of something that had been offered food and had decided to investigate the offering before committing. He was on the far bank on the back of a creature that could have powered a medium-sized city, scratching what might have been ears, when he called back to the group that the water was fine and he had worked out the return journey. Colonel Harwick, watching this, had not filed his preliminary report yet. He was waiting for something that he could not fully articulate, which was a thing that he could be reasonably confident Fetch was about to show him. The screaming asterisk Fetch explained when he rejoined them, dripping and in excellent spirits, is just acoustics. The electrical activity creates vibrations, the rock formations amplify them, and the channel shape produces the resonance. It sounds like screaming because the frequencies overlap with the range human vocal cords produce. He looked at the river. From an engineering perspective, it's a remarkable natural amplifier. The eel back was faster, though. Dravith Saul's report request to the Galactic Defense Coalition had been filed the previous week. Today's report update was significantly more urgent in tone. Colonel Harwick called Fetch into his office on day 12. The office was a practical space with a practical desk and a wall of screens showing monitoring data from the base and the surrounding environment. Harwick had coffee going, which Fetch appreciated. "Sit down," Harwick said. Fetch sat. "I've been running this installation for 6 months," Harwick said. "Before that, I did 30 years in environments that most species in this coalition would classify as extreme. I've been in the Arctic, the deep ocean, high-altitude mountain operations. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I have some frame of reference for what you're doing out there." "Yes, sir." "What you're doing out there," Harwick said, "is what every competent field operator does. You're reading the environment, adapting to it, using it. The fact that the environment is Morty's 7 doesn't change the principle." "No, sir." "What's unusual," Harwick said, looking at his coffee, "is that the other trainees are some of the most capable operators their species has produced, and they're having breakdowns while you're taking notes and collecting plant samples. Their equipment is working against them," Fetch said. Harwick looked up. "The suits and exoskeletons and energy shields," Fetch said. "They're designed for environments that make sense. They process information through systems calibrated to expected parameters. Morty's 7 doesn't match the expected parameters, so the equipment is producing noise instead of signal, and they're trying to trust the equipment instead of their own senses." He thought about how to say the next part. "When you're in the field without good equipment, you learn to trust what your body is telling you. That's not a special skill, it's just what you're left with." Harwick was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you grow up?" "Rural Montana, Bob Marshall Wilderness Country." "Grizzly territory?" "Black bear and grizzly both. Mountain lion too. We coexisted reasonably well." Fetch paused. "You learn the rules. And here you're applying the same rules." "The rules are mostly the same. The local wildlife is more varied and some of the physics are different, but the underlying logic is consistent." He thought about it. "Everything that's alive here has a reason for what it does. You figure out the reason, you can predict the behavior, and then coexisting gets easier." Harwick looked at him for a long time. "There's a xenopsychologist arriving tomorrow, he said. Dravith Saul. Coalition sent them to conduct psychological evaluations of the program participants." "I saw the notification. Is this about the eel thing? Because that was actually very safe by the time I got on." "It's about the general situation." Harwick paused. "Fetch, you should know that your biometrics have been flagging unusual readings." "Unusual how?" "Your stress indicators have been declining since we started the program. Most participants' readings go up as the environment gets more challenging. Yours go down." Harwick turned his screen to show the graph. "Yesterday, after the river crossing, your stress hormones were at baseline." Fetch looked at the graph. "That makes sense. I was more stressed at the base waiting for the briefing to start than I was in the river. At least in the river I knew what I was dealing with." Harwick looked at him for a long moment, then at the graph, then back at Fetch. "Get some sleep," he said. "Murder Canyon starts in 2 days." Dravith Saul arrived with a data collection kit and the careful expression of a xenopsychologist who had read the preliminary reports and was reserving judgment. Dravith Saul was tall and angular, with a crystalline-adjacent biology that processed information through a sensory array that operated on frequencies humans couldn't perceive. Their species, the Velhari, had 40 years of established xenopsychological methodology that had been applied successfully across 230 different species. They had a framework for everything. They spent the first day watching Fetch work. "Can I ask some questions?" they said on the second morning. "Sure," Fetch said. He was assembling the day's gear. "I was going to ask you some too. Do Velhari experience the same stress responses in hostile environments that the other species here do?" Dravith Saul paused. "That's not a typical response to an evaluation." "I'm curious. You've studied 230 species. What's the variation like in stress response patterns?" "Significant," Dravith Saul said. "They appeared to be recalibrating. Most species show elevated cortisol-equivalent markers in hostile environments. The specific compounds vary, but the pattern is consistent across." They stopped. "You're asking because you want to know how your species compares." I'm asking because I'm curious, Fetch said, but also yes. Draveth Saul looked at him. They looked at their data pad. They began asking their questions, which were structured around standard psychological assessment frameworks, and Fetch answered them carefully and honestly, and the answers were doing something to the framework that Draveth Saul was going to need time to think about. Human Fetch, they said eventually, can you describe what you experience when you encounter a potentially lethal scenario? Depends on the scenario. What specifically? The river, the electric eels. I assessed the water chemistry from the shoreline, determined it was less acidic than the briefing suggested, watched the eel movement patterns until I understood the patrol logic, picked an entry point that was outside the active territory boundary and crossed. He thought about it. I was focused, not stressed. There's a difference. Most species experience acute stress responses in those conditions. I was concentrating, Fetch said. When you're concentrating on something specific, there isn't room for the other stuff. You're just in the problem. The other stuff, Draveth Saul said, you mean fear. I mean everything that isn't useful to the immediate task. He looked at the data pad in their hands. Is this what the evaluation is about, whether I experience fear? Whether your responses are within species' normal parameters. And are they? Draveth Saul was quiet for a moment. I'm not certain yet. My dataset on humans is currently limited to you and Colonel Harwick. What's Harwick showing? Similar patterns adjusted for 6 months of Morty's 7 acclimatization. They paused. He's adapted to the environment in a way that isn't consistent with what we observe in other species after 6 months. He reads the environment rather than relying on equipment. He anticipates threats rather than reacting to them. Another pause. I thought initially that this was individual variation. I'm beginning to reconsider. Fetch looked at the base around him. He thought about what Harwick had said about reading environments. He thought about Montana and the Bob Marshall Wilderness and the things you learned when you lived in a place that required specific kinds of attention. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. What's Earth classified as in your system? Draveth Saul checked their data pad. Class 7 Death World. Why? Fetch considered this, and Morty's 7. Class 9. So we're here for training on a Class 9 world, Fetch said, and we come from a Class 7 world. Draveth Saul was very still. That is the implication, yes. So this is Fetch said, and paused to find the right phrase, not quite as challenging as home. The silence was quite long. I need to make some calls, Draveth Saul said. Murder Canyon had its reputation for concrete reasons. Located in the northern quadrant of Morty's 7, it had earned its name through consistent application of the principle that named it. The canyon walls were lined with geological formations that moved when nobody was looking directly at them. The floor was shrouded in mist that periodically screamed. The sky above the canyon was a different color from the sky everywhere else, as though the atmosphere had given up pretending to be consistent. The phase bare population density was approximately 4 times the baseline for the rest of the planet. This was the 72-hour final examination. Individual drops, minimal equipment, survive until pickup. The equipment allowance was basic shelter materials, 3 days of emergency rations, a water purification device, and 1 personal item of each trainee's choosing. Vethkar chose a military-grade survival beacon. His scales had been cycling through unusual colors for 3 days and had settled into something that hurt to look at directly. Pelara chose an emergency medical kit. She was breathing through her apparatus at a rate that suggested she was having a sustained conversation with her survival instincts about the situation. Orvac chose a portable weapons array. His exoskeleton had been repaired 3 times, and the joints were showing where that troubled the engineering staff. Sella chose a personal shield generator. Her crystalline form was at approximately 40% of its normal luminosity, and she had stopped talking except in frequencies that caused mild headaches. Fetch chose a fishing rod. Corporal Fetch, Draveth Saul said. They had come to observe the drop preparations and were finding the experience educational in ways they had not anticipated. That is your chosen survival equipment. The briefing mentioned a stream running through the canyon, Fetch said, checking his tackle box. And it's useful for terrain testing even if there's no fish. You saw me use it for that in the valley. The stream is mercury-based with dissolved heavy metals, and what our geological surveys describe as Dravethsal checked their notes, liquefied malice. That's an interesting classification. Is the malice a separate chemical compound, or is it a descriptor for the general atmospheric? It's a descriptor, Harwick said from the doorway. He looked at Fetch's fishing rod with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised and was now just accumulating data. The mercury content means you can't drink from it, but you're right that it'll have useful applications. Exactly, Fetch stood up. What's the phase bear density in the canyon? Hi, Harwick said. 4 times baseline. Don't run, don't make sudden movements, and... I know, Fetch said. He turned to the other trainees. Good luck out there. Stay still if you encounter something you don't recognize the behavior of and watch it until you understand it. The other trainees stared at him with expressions that represented the full range of feelings available to beings that were about to enter Murder Canyon. You say that, Vethkar said, his scales doing something complicated as if it is simple. It's not simple, Fetch said, but it's learnable. The wildlife isn't interested in fighting anything that isn't prey or a threat. You're neither if you behave correctly. He thought about how to say the next part without being discouraging. The canyon's going to be loud. The screaming mist sounds alarming, but it's acoustic. Focus on what's actually there rather than what the sound is suggesting is there. He picked up his pack and his fishing rod. I'm going to find a good campsite and get dinner organized, he said. See you at extraction. Fetch's pod touched down in Murder Canyon at 1347. The environment immediately presented itself. The ground pulsed, not in a threatening way exactly, more in the way of something that was very alive and was not particularly interested in concealing this fact. The air tasted like copper and something that did not have a name in any language Fetch knew, which he noted as interesting and moved on from. The sounds the canyon produced were a layered acoustic experience that resolved, once he had listened to it for a few minutes, into identifiable components. Thermal vent activity, geological settling, phase bear movement at distance, what appeared to be some kind of communication between the mobile rock formations. He found a campsite in 40 minutes. The selection process was methodical. High enough ground to avoid mercury runoff from the stream, close enough to the stream to use it as a resource and a territorial boundary that local predators would use as a navigation reference, sheltered from the prevailing wind direction indicated by the local vegetation angles, within observation range of 3 phase bear territory markers so he could track their patterns. The carnivorous rocks were the most interesting element. They were slow and appeared to have poor depth perception, which limited their effective range. They were also territorial in the way of most ambush predators, which meant they held position rather than pursuing. Once Fetch had identified their patrol boundaries, they were navigable with a small buffer zone. He spent an hour understanding their movement patterns and then began using them as a perimeter, because anything approaching his camp from that direction would have to navigate them first and would therefore announce itself. By the time the sun set, in colors that existed in spectrums that the human eye was not entirely designed for but found genuinely spectacular, Fetch had a shelter, a reliable water source from condensation collection that he had figured out from the canyon's thermal gradient patterns, a fire using materials that burned in colors he was adding to his notebook, and something cooking on it. The something was from the stream, not from the mercury water, from a species of creature that appeared to use the stream as territorial marking rather than habitat, hunting from the banks. It looked alarming. It tasted like chicken. He added it to the notebook under asterisk local fauna, dietary. He wrote the day's entry. Good campsite location. Phase bear activity moderate, patterns predictable. Carnivorous rocks useful as perimeter security. The screaming mist is actually pleasant once you understand it. Thermal vents running through limestone-equivalent formations creates a resonance that varies with temperature. Genuinely musical at the right pitch. Food situation, acceptable, should have brought marshmallows, also a better pot. The shelter material is effective, but the material properties are slightly different from Earth equivalents, so I've adjusted the construction method. Temperature dropped faster than predicted after sunset. The canyon acts as a cold air trap. Note for tomorrow. Establish morning routine earlier to maximize warm hours. He looked at the fire. He looked at the canyon walls, which were lit from below by the thermal vents, and from above by the wrong-colored sky, and from the middle by whatever the phase bears were doing with their shadow biology. He thought it was quite beautiful, actually. He went to sleep. The extraction team found him at 347 hours into the exercise. The team was wearing full hazmat suits and carrying enough armament to manage most tactical scenarios, because that was what extraction from Murder Canyon required. They found the other 4 trainees in states that the official report would later describe as varied and significant. Vethkar had built what appeared to be a philosophical shrine to his environmental suit's air recycling system inside his drop pod, and was in the process of having a conversation with it that his translator was rendering as a 3-part harmony. Pelara was performing medical procedures on a rock formation, her medical training having apparently reached an accommodation with her survival instincts that satisfied neither of them. Orvac had won several engagements against his own shadow and was currently in the process of winning a few more. His victory poses suggested a tactical situation that did not correspond to observable reality. Sella had achieved a state that the extraction team's sensor equipment described as quantum indeterminate. She was visible, but appeared to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, and was communicating in mathematical frequencies that the scanner described as geometrically consistent but physically improbable. Fetch was asleep. The extraction team leader checked the monitoring equipment 3 times and called the base. Colonel Harwick, go ahead. We've located all 5 trainees. 4 require immediate medical extraction. The human, a pause. The human's biometrics are showing stress levels at baseline, heart rate consistent with restful sleep. Brain activity indicates pleasant dreaming. A long silence from Harwick's end. Is his camp secure? The team leader looked at Fetch's campsite, which was organized and clean, and appeared to be operating under a more optimistic interpretation of local physics than the rest of Murder Canyon. The carnivorous rocks had arranged themselves around the perimeter in a formation that looked deliberate. The fire had burned down to coals. Something was hanging from a line between 2 stable rocks, apparently drying. His camp, the team leader said, appears to be secure. And sir? Yes. He's got the carnivorous rocks arranged like a garden. Another silence. Wake him up gently, Harwick said. Don't startle him. The team leader approached carefully and cleared his throat at a respectful distance. Fetch opened his eyes. He looked at the extraction team. He looked at the sky, which was doing something interesting with the pre-dawn thermal activity. Morning, he said. Good timing. I was just getting up to watch the sunrise. He sat up and reached for the camp stove. Coffee? I've been experimenting with local materials for fuel, and I think I've got it working acceptably. The extraction team looked at him for a long moment. Sir, the team leader said, you're aware that you've been alone in Murder Canyon for 47 hours. Yes, it's been excellent, very peaceful once you understand the local patterns. He offered a mug. The screaming mist is actually quite musical at sunrise. The thermal changes shift the resonance frequencies. This environment is classified as lethally hostile to all known life forms. Sure, if you fight it, most environments are dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. He looked around at the canyon. This one's just more direct about it. The team leader accepted the coffee. It was very good coffee. The psychological evaluation took 4 days. It was conducted by Draveth Saul, 3 xenopsychology specialists who had been hastily called in from their respective institutions, and a theoretical survival consultant whose academic speciality was the upper limits of environmental adaptation. They conducted the evaluation in a room with a table and chairs sized for multiple species and a lot of recording equipment. Fetch sat in his chair and answered questions and drank coffee and occasionally asked his own questions in return, which was not standard evaluation protocol, but which the evaluators found themselves answering because his questions were good. Corporal Fetch, Draveth Saul began, can you describe your experience in Murder Canyon? Good fishing, interesting geology, excellent acoustics. The phase bear population is higher than the baseline, but their movement patterns are actually more predictable because of the canyon's natural corridors. They use the same routes because the alternative routes take them through each other's territories. He made a note. The sunrise was remarkable, colors you don't see on Earth. Were you afraid? First night I was worried I'd set up too close to the stream. The mercury content makes the soil less stable and I didn't want to sink. Moved the camp 15 meters east after I checked. What about the environment itself? The phase bears, the mist. What about them? Didn't they seem dangerous? Fetch thought about this genuinely. Everything's potentially dangerous. The question is whether it's dangerous to you specifically in your current situation and whether you can affect that. He paused. The phase bears weren't interested in me. The mist wasn't harmful. The rocks were manageable, so none of it was actually dangerous in a meaningful sense. The xenopsychology specialist from the Arcturus system, a crystalline being who was currently producing quiet sounds that suggested internal stress, leaned forward. Can you describe Earth's environmental conditions for comparison? Sure, standard geological activity, tectonic movement, volcanic zones, regular seismic events. Weather patterns including major storm systems, temperature extremes, precipitation events. Wildlife across the full predation spectrum, from apex predators like bears and big cats to venomous species like certain snakes and spiders. Microscopic biological threats including pathogenic bacteria and viruses. And this is considered normal. It's what Earth is. Fetch, consider the question. You learn to navigate it. Most of it won't affect you if you're paying attention. Australia, Dravethsal said, reading from their notes. Your briefing materials mentioned Australia as a specific region. Oh sure, high density of venomous species including some of the most toxic in the world. The wildlife is generally more aggressive than in other regions. The climate is challenging. The fire conditions in some seasons. He paused. Honestly, Australia is its own thing. The people there are fine. They've adapted. And your home region? Montana, we've got grizzly bears and mountain lions and black bears and wolf packs and rattlesnakes and significant winter conditions. He thought about it. It's good country. I like it. The theoretical survival consultant, who had been quiet for most of the session, spoke up. Corporal Fetch, if you were to apply our classification system to Earth, the same system that rates Morty's 7 as Class 9, what would Earth be? Fetch thought about this seriously, which everyone in the room could tell because he got very still and looked at a point slightly above the horizon. Hard to say without knowing the exact criteria, he said finally. But if Morty's 7 is a 9, and I'm being honest with myself about the comparison, the variability of Earth's weather systems is higher, the biological threat diversity is comparable if not greater, the geological activity is similar, and the apex predator suite is more varied. He paused. I'd say 11, maybe 12. Higher for the ocean zones. The deep ocean is genuinely difficult. The room was very quiet. The scale, Dravethsal said carefully, currently goes to 13. Is 13 the highest? 13 was the theoretical maximum, the theoretical survival consultant said. Their voice had a quality that suggested they were revising several things simultaneously before this evaluation. Fetch looked at the table. What's above 13? Nobody answered immediately, because nobody had needed to answer that question before. Dravethsal stood up. I need to make some calls, they said, for the second time in a week, and the calls were different in kind from the ones they had made before. The suspension of the training program came in a memo that was classified at a level that required 3 different security clearances to access. Colonel Harwick received it while looking at biometric reports. He read it, then sat with his coffee for a while and then went to find Fetch. Fetch was in the cafeteria. He had made the hot sauce work on the base's ration packs in a way that Harwick found both impressive and slightly alarming, and he was eating lunch with the easy contentment of someone who had figured out their environment. Program suspended, Harwick said, sitting down. I heard. Fetch looked up. Are they all right, the other 4? They'll be fine, need some time. Harwick poured himself coffee. Thal's stable. Pelera's coming around. Orvak's arguing with the medical staff, which is a good sign. Sella's visible again. Good. Fetch looked out the window at Morty's 7, which was doing what it always did, which was everything. Am I in trouble? No, Harwick looked at his coffee. You're being offered a treaty. What kind? Earth joining the Galactic Defense Coalition as a full member. He set down his mug. There's a condition. What condition? The Void Swarm, Harwick said. Fetch had read the Void Swarm briefing materials 3 times before the formal consultation session, because reading something once was not enough for something with that many variables. The Void Swarm were not a military problem. This was the first thing he noticed, reading the thousand-year history of the Coalition's engagement strategy. They were being approached as a military problem, with weapons, tactical doctrine, force deployment, and those approaches had been consistently failing for 1,000 years, which was the kind of pattern that suggested the framing was wrong rather than the execution. He read the behavioral documentation, the feeding cycle analysis, the expansion patterns, the response data from previous military engagements. He made a lot of notes. The consultation session was held at Galactic Defense Coalition headquarters, which Fetch reached via a transport that was significantly more comfortable than the one he had arrived on Morty's 7 in, though he had found that one fine. Headquarters was large in the way of organizations that had been operating for several thousand years and had accumulated infrastructure accordingly. The consultation room held 12 beings, 5 military commanders from different Coalition species, 3 scientists from the Coalition's research division, Draveth Saul, Colonel Harwick, and 1 Coalition official whose title Fetch did not catch but whose expression suggested they were senior. "Corporal Fetch," the official said, "we've reviewed your evaluation materials and Colonel Harwick's reports from Morty's 7. We'd like your assessment of the Void swarm data." "Sure," Fetch said. "Can I ask some questions first?" "You may." "The Void swarm's expansion rate over the last 1,000 years, has it been consistent?" The research division beings exchanged looks. One of them pulled up a display, reasonably consistent, some variation in specific regions. "Has the variation correlated with anything? Environmental conditions in the consumed systems, population density, resource availability?" Another exchange of looks. "We haven't specifically analyzed." "The feeding cycles," Fetch said. "The data shows roughly regular intervals between system consumption events. Has anyone modeled that against the swarm's energy requirements versus energy expenditure?" A long pause. "No," one of the scientists said slowly. "We've been analyzing it as a tactical schedule rather than." "A biological cycle," Fetch said. "Right." He looked at his notebook. "The expansion pattern, is it directional or does it vary?" "Primarily directional with some. Following stellar density, towards denser regions or away from them." The scientists conferred with visible urgency. "Towards," one of them said, "predominantly towards higher stellar density areas." "So they're moving toward higher resource concentration." Fetch made a note. "That's predator behavior, not military behavior. They're not expanding to occupy territory. They're following food." He looked up. "Have you tried disrupting the food signal rather than engaging the swarm directly?" The room was very quiet. "What does that mean specifically?" One of the military commanders said. "If they're following stellar density gradients, you could potentially use those gradients to redirect them. High-mass stellar objects affect the local density signal." He looked at the data on the display. "I'd need to know more about their sensory range to say whether it's feasible, but the principle is solid. You're trying to fight them on their terms. If they're apex predators following a food trail, you don't fight an apex predator. You change the environment so the food trail goes somewhere else." Another long silence. "That approach," one of the researchers said carefully, "has never been considered." "Because we've been thinking about it as a war," Fetch said. "Wars have tactics. Wildlife management has different tools." He looked at his notes. "Can I get more detailed data on the swarm's sensory mechanisms? I want to understand how they detect stellar mass density before I say anything more specific." Draveth Saul made a note that read, "Recommend immediate expanded research collaboration. Human analytical framework appears to have identified structural gap in thousand-year strategic approach." The Coalition official looked at Fetch for a long moment. "Corporal Fetch, they said, how long would it take you to review the full data set?" "Depends on how much there is." Fetch looked at the display, which was showing the thousand-year history of the Coalition's engagement data. "Give me a week. I'll want to talk to the biologists and the astrophysics team separately." "You'll have whatever access you need." The official leaned forward. "There's one more thing." "Yes." "The treaty includes something called an advisory role. Earth would contribute expertise to the Coalition's strategic assessment process." They paused. "Based on what we've seen this month, we're specifically interested in human environmental analysis capabilities. Someone from Earth would be here permanently. A rotating team, initially. The scope would expand based on results. The official looked at their data. We're told you're currently on a 3-year posting at a base that hasn't been attacked once during your tenure. Correct. Would you be open to an extended assignment? Fetch thought about this. He thought about Montana and the Bob Marshall Wilderness and 3 years at a Nevada base with good fishing nearby. He thought about Morty's 7 and Faye's bears and carnivorous rocks arranged like a garden and the sunrise colors that didn't exist back home. He thought about 1,000 years of the wrong approach to a wildlife problem and a data set that nobody had analyzed from the right direction yet. I'd want to finish reviewing the Void swarm data first, he said, and I'll need access to a decent kitchen. The ration packs here are fine with the right hot sauce, but a week is a long time. The official looked at Harwick. Harwick was looking at his coffee with the expression of a man who had known this was coming. We can arrange a kitchen, the official said. And coffee. Whatever you need. Then yes, Fetch said. I'll need a week with the data and then I'll tell you what I think. I'm not promising anything, but the directional approach seems worth exploring, and there are a few other things in the behavioral data I want to check. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. Can we start with the sensory mechanism data? I want to understand what they're responding to before I think about how to redirect it. 2 weeks later, Fetch sat in the research division's main conference room with the Void swarm team and approximately 300 pages of notes. He had organized the data in a way that nobody had organized it before, which was partly because he had started from a different question. Not how do we defeat the Void swarm, but what does the Void swarm want, and what would redirect it? 3 things, he said, clicking through the display he had built. First, the feeding cycle is approximately 42 of your standard years, plus or minus 2 years based on distance from the previous consumed system. They're not following a schedule. They're responding to an internal biological signal. That means that there are periods when they're not actively feeding, one of the researchers said slowly, between cycles. Right, and during those periods, the behavioral data shows reduced aggression and different movement patterns. Fetch clicked to the next display. Second, the directional bias isn't toward stellar density exactly. It's toward a specific combination of stellar density and certain spectral signatures. They're selecting for something. I've been working with your astrophysics team, and we think it's a particular hydrogen isotope concentration. Why? We don't know yet, but if it's a biological requirement, if they need that isotope the way we need certain vitamins, then a region with low concentrations of it might be naturally unattractive to them. He made a note. Third, and this is the part I'm least certain about, the expansion pattern has a gap. There's a region in the northern quadrant of the mapped territory where the swarm has approached and diverted 3 separate times over 400 years. Something about that region is repellent to them. The room was very quiet. Nobody noticed that, one of the researchers said. It's in the data. It's just not obvious unless you're looking at the geographic pattern rather than the event pattern. Fetch clicked to the map. I want to study what's different about that region. If we understand the repellent, we can potentially create it synthetically. He looked around the room. I'm not saying this is definitely workable. I'm saying it's a different direction from the last 1,000 years of approaches, and the last 1,000 years of approaches have a consistent outcome. Draveth Saul, who had been sitting in the corner of the room, made a note that read, Recommend permanent expanded collaboration. Human Analytical Approach has identified 3 new research vectors in 2 weeks. None of these vectors were in existing strategic analysis. The coalition official, who was also present, looked at Fetch. We're prepared to discuss the treaty terms formally, they said, if you're ready. I've got a few things I want to finish in the dataset first, Fetch said. But yes, Earth should be part of this. He paused. I do have a question about the membership terms. Yes. Is there a Morty's 7 clause? Because I'd like to go back. I didn't get to see the volcano. Harwick, who was also in the room, produced a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was not a laugh either. We can discuss the details, the official said. Good, Fetch opened his notebook. Can we go back to the isotope question? I want to run through some of the spectral data with the astrophysics team this afternoon. He spent the afternoon with the astrophysics team. He spent the evening writing up his preliminary report. He made coffee at some point because it helped him think. Outside the coalition headquarters viewport, space stretched in every direction with the patient indifference of something that had been there for a very long time, and would be there for a very long time after everyone currently in the building was gone. In that space, somewhere, the void swarm was following its feeding cycle with the consistent, single-minded logic of a species doing what it had always done. The coalition had been fighting it for 1,000 years. Dean Fetch had been looking at the data for 2 weeks and had found 3 things nobody had noticed. He had a notebook full of questions and a week's worth of access to a research division that had just had its fundamental assumptions revised by a corporal from Montana who had come to space because he wanted to see something new. He looked out the viewport. He made a note. Interesting place, he wrote. Weather's manageable. Wildlife varies. Good research opportunities. Note, find out if there are any field sites with decent fishing. He turned to a fresh page and went back to work.